Hi everybody. Thought I'd bring you outside today. We're going to be talking about Chapter 7 now, and I want to break this into a couple of different parts. If you'll recall, we talked in Chapter 2 about some of the theoretical approaches to understanding archaeological evidence that we excavate. So we've learned how to do archaeology, how to excavate, how to survey, how to analyze. But data doesn't say anything on its own. It's just data is just stuff. We have to interpret it. We need to understand it somehow. And we're coming to now a very important part. I would argue arguably one of the most important things to have happened, events to have happened in human history, really. That is to say, Homo sapiens sapiens history. That is to say, the Neolithic Revolution. Everything that you know about life today, living today, requires humans to have settled down and build permanent settlements and control their environment around them, to build structures, to build communities that live in those structures, and to build hierarchies and places for people in society. All of that relies upon a change in thinking about the way that humans live in the world. So far, what we've been looking at is humans as an evolutionary animal species that is adapting to different environmental conditions, changing environmental conditions. But what we're going to see now is that humans started to think a little bit more about what they could do to increase their opportunities, increase their survivability and their adaptability, not just by creating a tool in that moment, but by actually changing the environment that they lived in entirely. Now, that has some possibly very bad repercussions for humans. We're now at the pretty far down that road, and we're changing the environment so rapidly that actually we could be harming ourselves as a consequence. And actually we'll see that even from the very early days, there were some hints that maybe what we were starting to do in the Neolithic Revolution wasn't necessarily in our favor. But we did it. It's not inevitable, but because there are still human groups that are hunters and gatherers. That was what people did for all of human history up until about 10,000 years or so ago. And what we want to look at is how this Neolithic Revolution took place in different places around the world. Now, the reason why I brought up Chapter 2 is because we're going to look at some evidence, and we're going to look at places from different locations where the Neolithic Revolution happened. But before we do that, I want to think about the whys. Why did this happen? Why did it not very much happen in the first 100,000 years, or 150,000, or 190,000 years of human existence? If humans have been around for 200,000 years, why were we just doing the same thing that our ancestors had been doing, that is to say, hunting and gathering, for 1,000,000 years prior to that? Why did we change? Why then? Why in these locations? And understanding these whys requires us to think about some theoretical concepts. So that's why I want to bring up Chapter 2 again. Now let's talk about what the terms that I'm trying to get at here. Sedentism and domestication. These are two related concepts, but they're different from one another. Sedentism refers to groups of people that stay in one place and create permanent settlements. Sedentary lifestyle. Sedentism. Now, in order to be sedentary, you need to have enough resources in a local area that don't require you to move from place to place. We've seen in prior lectures that humans had this opportunity to follow herds of animals or seasonally move from one place to another according to what kind of plants were available. If you are choosing to be sedentary and stay in one place, you either need to produce food that maybe nature might not provide on its own, or you need an area that is has a catchment around it that allows you to survive. So we'll look a little bit about this juxtaposition of food production and certain areas like oases that might have actually generated sedentary groups before they started producing and controlling their environment. Just optimal zones. We'll talk about that a few times in the next few lectures. The other concept is domestication. Now, domestication is it's a technical term that we use that relates to essentially the genetic selection of new species that we have artificially selected for characteristics that are favorable to us, that we want. So natural selection selects characteristics that make them either survivable or not. And you have a range within a gene pool of an animal species that you have, let's say, hippopotami. You have the smallest hippopotami and you have the largest hippopotami. If you're too small, you might get predated upon by an alligator or a lion or something like that. If you're too large, you require a lot of food, maybe too much food, and you might actually starve to death because you're too large for the area that you can survive in. So natural selection selects a certain size of hippopotamus that's in between the extremes of the smallest and the largest. But humans, at some point, stepped in and started taking over the role of natural selection that weeded out the smallest by eliminating them through death, or eliminating the largest through starvation. And we selected characteristics that were suitable to us, not necessarily survival for them and their species, but we selected them to survive. So why would we do that? Now, just in your mind's eye, think about 20,000 years ago. You're in a hunting and gathering community of people, and you're living in the landscape. You're surrounded at night by packs of hungry animals, carnivores that are wanting your food. Let's say there's some wolves out there. Wolves will try and come close to your campfire, but if they're snarling, snapping at you, trying to get your food, trying to steal it from you, or maybe even eat you, you're going to wave them away with your fire stick. You're going to wave them away. You're going to throw things at them. You're going to get those snarling, predatory animals away from you as soon as you can. But imagine that there's one wolf pup, kind of cute, nice personality, not so afraid of you, but also not snarling and snapping at you either. Comes up and submissive and rolls on its back. What do? Well, you might throw it a scrap of food. Why would you do that? Well, if you have maybe it's just cute to you for one thing, but the other thing is maybe it keeps vermin away. Maybe it keeps mice and rats that are eating into your stores of food, or running across your floors at night. Maybe you want to keep these things away. So you've got a wolf that is okay with you, and it actually has a purpose. If you find another wolf pup, a female and a male, maybe you can breed those characteristics into the next generation, that they're a good personality with cute characteristics. Now, we know that something like this must have happened because the earliest domesticated species that we know of is the dog. All dogs are descended from wolves. They're genetically fairly recently diverged, but they didn't do so through natural selection. All dogs that we have, domesticated dog species, were genetically selected by us. It's artificial selection, not natural selection. So those dogs we created generation after generation after generation, and now we have a whole range of these things. Other animals as well. The auroch, Bos primigenius, is this huge, giant, frightening cow-like creature, but it's huge. It's like a giant ox. The auroch would have killed you so quickly. It was a huge megafauna and lived in Asia and parts of Africa and into Europe. You don't want that anywhere near your settlement. But if you can find a docile, smaller scale auroch, and you can breed it with another smaller, more docile auroch, eventually you have it bred into what we know of as a cow. And if you see wild sheep out there, they're not big fluffy things that are totally stupid and can't fend for themselves. They're really capable animals. Wild sheep are extremely successful in the wild. But what we've bred into them is total dependence on humans. They're frightened of everything, and they depend upon us. They will happily go under our guidance. Even if we hit them with sticks and things, they will be like, okay, I'll do as I'm told, because they have been bred to be habituated to humans. We've also bred other characteristics into them, things like milk and wool. And we perpetuate the production of milk by culling the male lambs in the springtime. So ewes constantly create milk because they're constantly in the cycle of reproduction, producing milk. So we start to manage the world around us, not by making tools exactly, although sometimes that does happen, but by manipulating the environment itself and bending it to our will. That's domestication, and it can be done in a range of things, not just animals, but plants. There are wild species of plants that we have made dependent upon ourselves. They can't reproduce or survive without our intervention. That's domestication of plants. But here's the flip side of that. Once we start to create plants that are dependent upon us, and we are sedentary and we're fixed to a spot, that means we become dependent upon those domesticated plants and animals too. We become domesticated. So this is essentially what the Neolithic Revolution is moving out of this old way of doing things, the hunting and gathering, moving through the landscape, adapting to the way the environment saw fit, to actually changing our minds about the way the world worked, put us in the driver's seat, and started to steer the environment in a way that we wanted it to. This had effects that weren't always good, but it did create also a domesticated human environment that created new types of societies. And it's that road that we carried on, many cultures carried on, to create the next thing that we're going to look at in this class a few chapters from now, the urban revolution. You can't have cities and states. You can't have some of these achievements of a civilization without domestication and sedentism. You don't have the pyramids without the state. You don't have the state without agriculture, and you don't have the agriculture without some kind of a territory. So this is what we want to look at, but why and how it took place is something that's going to require a little bit of thinking in terms of theory, right? So let's turn to that in the next part.